Hi there, I'm the _twig and I like analysing game rules. So in this video I'm going to be breaking down the doors on how WotC internally benchmarks their monsters, and probably a few other things too. Right from the top though, I need to give credit. I was not the one who found this stuff. It was a guy called Fallen Dank on Reddit, or simply Fallen on Discord. I'll link his original thread in the description. I've talked with him a fair amount and also reperformed his maths, and this seems to have some value. Before I continue though, I want to give a shout out to the little monsters who support me in my Patreon, in particular my terrifyingly cute and fluffy BBEG SK. These guys get access to my private Discord and get to see my videos early. On some of them they even get audio only versions which I make before I even start the editing process. Right, so this stuff came to light just after Playtest 6 came out, thanks to the Rogue's new feature Cunning Strike, as well as the improvements that it then gets. Let's start by just going over that feature. You've developed cunning ways to use your sneak attack. When you deal sneak attack damage, you can add one of the following Cunning Strike effects. Each effect has a die cost, which is the number of sneak attack damage dice you must forego to add the effect. You remove the die before rolling, and the effect occurs immediately after the attack's damage is dealt. Some of these effects require a saving throw, but they don't matter for the purposes of this video. You then have 4 options at 5th level. For a cost of 1d6 you can either disarm, poison, knock an enemy prone, or move half your speed without provoking opportunity attacks. When you reach 14th level you get some more options. For 2d6 you can daze your target, for 66 you can straight up make them unconscious, or for 3d6 you can blind them. The Swashbuckler also gets some more effects. At 9th level they can spend 1d6 to cause a sort of taunt effect, similar to the Ancestral Guardian Barbarian, or they can spend 3d6 to charm everyone within 30 feet. Then at 13th level they can spend 2d6 to add 1d6 to their AC, or add 1d6 to an ally's attack roll or saving throw. So, a lot of options there, but we now need to take a small logical leap. Doing these things is equivalent in power to just doing the damage. For example, poisoning an enemy is equivalent to doing 3.5 round up to 4 damage to them. We can then apply this damage to monsters which inflict conditions to work out the actual effective damage of their attacks. Let's show this off with an actual example. This is a Ghast. It's a CR2 creature, and the DMG has this handy table telling us how much damage we can expect a creature of any CR to do. In this case, 15 to 20 damage. The Ghast's bite attack only does 12 damage though, which is below that threshold, until you add the additional poison of its stench trait. If we add back poison's converted damage of 4, the Ghast's bite now does 16 damage, which puts it in the expected damage range. The DMG table is not a super reliable source. For example, the HP numbers are comically inflated. There are only 11 CR3 creatures with over 85 HP. But I have done some similar calculations on a small sample of other creatures, and the damage column specifically seems to match up decently well. And when it doesn't, there's normally a fairly obvious reason why. For example, the Vrock came up with just 24 damage, despite CR6 recommending 39 to 44 damage. However, the Vrock can also fly. Now we wanted to get a bit more evidence for this, so we did some digging around and found a 5-year-old podcast called DM's Deep Dive 18 Monster Design with Jeremy Crawford, which was hosted on the Don't Split the Podcast YouTube channel. Take a listen to this.
One of the things that we do in our monster design is convert certain conditions into what I refer to as virtual damage. That is something the Dungeon Master's Guide doesn't go into very much, but once you realize we're doing that, a lot of our design starts to make more sense. Here's a great example of it. If there is an effect that paralyzes a creature and or otherwise deprives a person of their turn, we often, just for shorthand, we refer to it as turn denial. How we account for that as virtual damage when we're figuring out a monster CR is we look for the lowest level spell in the game that applies that condition, and we basically cause that effect to deal an amount of virtual damage equal to the average damage for a spell of that level. For example, this turn denial thing. The standard way of doing that in the spell list is hold person. And so we then look at that level, what is sort of an iconic amount of damage output, Scorching Ray. And so if you see a monster that the only thing it's doing is it paralyzes somebody, when we do our CR calculation, that paralysis is given the same damage value as if that creature were casting Scorching Ray.
There you have it. Paralysis is worth the same amount of damage as Scorching Ray, 21 damage. With this information under our belts, we could compile an effective damage for each spell slot. Note that we're looking as much as possible for spells which do single target damage and nothing else. Obviously this can't always be achieved, so I've had to make a few assumptions, primarily an arbitrary 1.5 times multiplier on AoE damage. Anyway, here's what we got. For cantrips, I chose Firebolt, which does 6 damage. At first level, Magic Missile does 11 damage. Second level, Scorching Ray does 21 damage. Third level, Lightning Arrow does 32 damage. 2d8 of that is AoE, so I applied the arbitrary 1.5 times modifier on that. Fourth level, Blight does 8d8 damage for 36. Fifth level, Immolation does 54 damage, assuming 1 turn of the continuous damage rider. Sixth level, Harm does 63 damage. Some of you might have expected me to choose Disintegrate here, but I think that Disintegrate gets a sort of a fame boost, kind of like how Fireball does. 7th level Crown of Stars does 78 damage. This is assuming 3 uses of the stars. 8th level Abby Dalzim's Horrid Wilting does 81 damage, again arbitrary modifier for AoE of 1.5 times. 9th level Psychic Scream does 14d6 damage and stuns, and it's an AoE. I've applied 10 damage for the stun, and the AoE 1.5 times modifier takes that up to 89 damage. For the most part, it's approximately 10 damage per spell level. Obviously my assumptions may be swinging that a little bit, and Crown of Stars specifically is probably an outlier, but the 10 damage per spell level seems like an okay benchmark to work with. Let's compare that back to the Cunning Strike effects. For 3d6 you can either charm or blind your opponents, which is 11 damage, equivalent to a first level spell, and that's where you'll find Charm Person and Colour Spray. It costs 1d6 or 4 damage to knock an enemy prone, which should hopefully obviously be equivalent to shoving someone, and you can do that with the cantrip Thorn Whip. Thorn Whip even has a smaller damage die to account for it. So yeah, I think that this tracks back. These effects can all be allocated a spell level, which can then be allocated a damage level. Let's test this further by having a look at a more complex monster. One of my all-time favourites, the Starspawn Seer. As far as I'm concerned, the Starspawn, probably with the exception of the Starspawn Mangler, are the best designed monsters in 5e. The Starspawn Seer is a CR 13 monster, so it should be doing 81 to 86 damage per round. First up, it has a passive called Out of Phase Movement, which lets it do 5 damage to anyone it runs through or hide in walls. Let's assign 10 damage to that. We'll assume it runs through 2 people. Next up, multi-attack allows it to use Comet Staff twice or Psychic Orb twice. Comet Staff first. A 2-handed Comet Staff does 28 damage, and it can also incapacitate. So I'll add another 10 to that since it's a bit like Tasha's Hideous Laughter. That means that the total of the Comet Staff multi-attack is 76 damage, plus the 10 from Out of Phase Movement for 86 damage. Right as expected. Next up is the Psychic Orb multi-attack, which does 27 damage per hit, although this is actually intended to be used on a Starspawn Hulk, which has the ability to turn this Psychic Orb into an AoE. So I'll apply my 1.5 times multiplier to the 27 for 41 damage per attack, or 82 per round. Add on Out of Phase and we're up to 91 damage, which is slightly above the benchmark thanks to its teamwork. Finally, the Seer has a Recharge 6 ability called Collapse Distance. This teleports another creature in a similar fashion to Vortex Warp, and then does 39 AoE damage. 20 damage for Vortex Warp's second level and a 1.5 times AoE modifier for the remainder, plus 10 from Out of Phase Movement, and that gives us 89 damage. Again, slightly above the benchmark because it's using a recharge feature. When accounting for additional effects, all 3 modes of attack are at the expected damage level, or slightly above for an explainable reason. The Starspawn Seer does have another feature called Bend Space. However, this is a defensive feature. It's not entirely clear yet how defences impact CR, and given the absolutely whack HP numbers on the table, and very few features like Cunning Strike which just straight up spell it out, that will probably be a lot harder to work out. I expect that it's probably similar though. Defensive features will have a flat amount of HP which they are equivalent to. For example, maybe non-magical resistance is worth 10 HP. Fallen, the guy I learnt this stuff from, also reckons that a lot of the same methodology is used in player character feature design. He's pointed out that on a standard subclassless, featless, by-the-books build that you would find on a casual table, a 5th level barbarian, fighter, monk and rogue all do approximately 21 DPR, which is equivalent to a 2nd level spell. Just think about that for a moment. 5th level barbarians effectively have 2nd level spells at will. That's bizarre. I've not actually looked into the player side stuff as much as the DM side stuff though, so I can't really say that much more about it. Anyway, that's the new discovery, or possibly rediscovery after 5 years, about monster design. What do I think about it? It's completely insane. The idea that features like pack tactics, or imposing disadvantage on saving throws, or incapacitating a player could be worth a fixed amount of damage is ridiculous. In terms of designing 450 monsters in a rush because you need to get the monster manual finished in a month though, it is definitely a legitimate way to improve efficiency, and I expect that's its primary purpose. It's a method that the designers can use to eyeball a monster and say, yeah, that's about right. Specific high-profile monsters like the Beholder and the Mind Flayer seem to ignore this method, so they're probably manually tuned. I also tried looking at the Flind, which is a null in Volo specifically designed to be a BBEG, and it's hitting way above CR9. This method does lead to some things like the infamous Intellect Devourer though, which actually only hits about 1 CR above in terms of damage output, and given its shocking defences, it probably gets pulled back down to CR2. Whoever designed this is the person you can blame for all of your TPKs to Intellect Devourers. Hope you enjoyed this. If you learned some cool stuff, consider subscribing, and I always appreciate it if you can share with a friend. I don't think I'm going to be going back to playtest 6 unless there's a massive request for something in specific. It's kind of late, so instead I'll do some other fun stuff. Bye!